Hi, this is Sam, and this is my teaching demonstration. This is going to be a brief lecture on abstract and concrete language in fiction and how we as writers can use these tools to our advantage. So, first, I'm going to go through an overview of what we're going to be talking about. So, first, I'm going to start by defining terms. I want to make sure we're all on the same page when it comes to the rest of the lecture. After that, I would like to discuss some of the excerpts that I assigned for ahead of the lecture. Then we're going to talk about using uh, abstract and concrete language and what are some of the benefits and drawbacks of each one. And we are going to end this out with a prompt that you can take home and that we'll be discussing in the future. So, first, to begin, when I'm talking about concrete language, I am talking about the kind of language that will describe a real thing. So, as defined in Chapter 2 of Imaginative Writing by Janet Burroway, this is the kind of language that will talk about an image, something that can be seen, heard, smelled, tasted, or touched. And that's me quoting directly from Burroway. And this language is often detailed, meaning that there is a degree of focus and specificity. This is the kind of language that I have personally encountered most often in what's often called realistic fiction. Anything that purports to be grounded. So, grounded is another adjective that I might use to describe this kind of language. This is also often found in um, things like instructional material. You'll find this kind of direct, concrete language also a lot in creative nonfiction, which just goes to show how these different genres really do pull from a lot of the same skill sets. When I'm talking about abstract language, I'm talking mostly about what Burroway in Chapter 2 of Imaginative Writing defines as figures of speech. So, the English language is very vast and very complicated, and these are various ways that it can be vast and complicated. So these examples, metonymy, synecdoche, personification, metaphor, and simile, which I have defined on these slides from chapter 2 of imaginative writing. These are all things that you can use to talk about something without necessarily talking about it. This is ways that prose and poetry even can blend. So, this is also why, as writers, you will benefit from reading a wide variety of materials because you'll be exposed to more of these little tricks of language. So, the forms that you're most likely to come across, or rather, the forms that we're going to be talking about in this next part of the lecture are mostly personification and metaphor, if only because those are the things that are most present in the excerpts that I chose. And I also think that as a writer, personally, I find that those three are a little bit easier for me to employ, if only because metonymy and synecdoche do require a level of signification to our current culture, which you might not want to do, for example. So, moving on to the excerpts that I assigned, I would love it if this let me scroll down instead of that. Um, so this is the section, actually, this beginning part is what I want to talk about in this excerpt anyway. And also this next sentence. So when you're reading this excerpt, you can see this is using very, very concrete language. The author, Harriet Wilson, is describing in detail just these are the events that are happening in this character's life. Now, there's obviously a lot going on between the lines, but in terms of the events that are happening on the page, they are very direct. So you'll see this last sentence in this paragraph, her labors were multiplied. She was quite indispensable, although but 70 years old. So in that sentence, you learn quite a bit of information, even though the words themselves are very simple, just stating it like it is. Later, at the beginning of this next paragraph, you'll see the author writes, Mrs. Belmont was in doubt about the utility of attempting to educate people of color who were incapable of elevation. This is not necessary. This is not a true statement. And it is not a statement that the narrator nor the author agrees with. However, in putting it in such plain language, you can see that Mrs. Belmont, the character, unequivocally does believe that statement. So, in using this very direct, concrete language, you learn a lot about Mrs. Belmont without room for arguing against her character. It is what it is. As we move on to our second excerpt, if you look at the excerpt from Oreo by Fran Ross, you'll see that it's making me write on the screen instead of scrolling, but that's fine. So you can see that as the in this excerpt, you can see the author, Fran Ross, is personifying inanimate objects. You can see that she has taken leaky pipes and a broken escalator and elevated them into being these challenges, almost these figures that are deliberately impeding travelers on their way to their destination. Doing this has several effects. One being that Oreo, the novel, is a retelling of a Greek myth, and that kind of personification was very common in that kind of literature. And so it is thematically appropriate to do so. But in addition, it also creates a sort of mystique to the journey. It adds a level of like grandiosity to it, where if Ross were to, for example, just say Oreo walked up the broken escalator in the subway station. It had never worked ever since it had been installed. And while she was walking, she was able to avoid the leaking pipes. And then she went on. So that is not bad. It's what happened, but it doesn't have quite the same feeling to it. It doesn't have quite the same tone. So you can see that this excerpt is using kind of a blend. This is a couple of paragraphs wherein something does occur. Oreo does go up the stairs and get onto the subway, but we also learn a lot about how she views the world. We learn a lot about what she prioritizes. We learn a lot about how she envisions race, which is a relevant theme to the novel. And all of that comes through the personification of these inanimate objects that wouldn't otherwise be present in the story. And then if we move on to the third excerpt, which begins, picture the 1920s as a drag race whose entries are vying for the champion gros benage of the times. This whole section of Mumbo Jumbo, there isn't much that happens in it in terms of the rest of the plot of the novel, but this section, which is incredibly abstracted, which uses a lot of personification and metaphor and simile, it uses those things to set a tone. It lets you know that the novel that this is contained in is not one is one that is incredibly thematic in addition to being plot driven, and that the plot of this novel is one that relies on understanding the kind of dynamics that are at play. And I want you to imagine a version of this excerpt where Ishmael Reed had just written about how, you know, history at the time was very complicated, and a lot of people in this culture felt this way, and people in that culture felt another way. That would be a very compelling history textbook, but this is a novel. So you can see that the use of the abstract language here really creates an exciting and vibrant tone with imagery that really, really sticks with you. And I want to emphasize that none of these excerpts are better or worse than the other. They're all in 3 published novels that I greatly enjoy, and they all use these tools differently. So when we use these tools, or rather, it's important to recognize that that's what these things are. So when you're using concrete language, some of the benefits come because sometimes you don't want to leave things up for interpretation. For example, it would not be great if I, the reader, were able to envision a version of Mrs. Belmont from the Harriet Wilson excerpt. If I could envision a version of her who wasn't racist and was just like, I don't know, in a bad mood all the time and just didn't happen to like Fredo, the narrator, that's not really a fair reading of the book. And so it's important that Harriet Wilson, in direct, concrete terms, said, no, this woman is a racist. And in addition, sometimes, especially in a very plot-driven story, sometimes when you use a lot of abstract language, it can be really difficult as a reader to tell what is going on. If there is a plot and there are 10,000 metaphors that I need to decipher before I get to the next plot event, I'm going to forget a lot of important information. And I think most readers are similar in that way. It's just part of being a person. So that's why you do sometimes just need to say the thing that is happening. But some of the drawbacks, so the tone might be a little stiff. You might, like I said in the example about what Mumbo Jumbo isn't, you might come off like you're writing instructional prose. You might come off like you're writing a textbook. These are not always bad. I don't want this to come off as like, never do this. I'm saying that if that's not what you want to do, then use different kinds of language. And also, it might also be more difficult to integrate other tools of fiction writing. So I know for me, I really struggle with using things like symbolism in my writing when I am writing very directly. It is a little bit more difficult for me to have a very thematically driven story when I'm not writing with a lot of metaphor in it. So maybe that's just a me thing, but it's something to consider as you work on your own writing. And then when you are using abstract language, I've found as a reader and a writer that things like metaphor and personification can add a lot to the emotional resonance of a given piece. It also makes it so that a story can be about more than one thing. Again, that goes back to, it's a little bit easier, at least for me, to fold symbols into my writing when I am using more abstract language. And I also think that it's important to note that as writers, we get to test the bounds and set the limits of what we use the English language for in the first place. And I think that that kind of experimentation is really rewarding, and it's something that we should all keep trying to do. So it's also important to note that if you are too abstract, you're going to have readers who don't know what is happening in your story. Um, I am guilty of this. I do this a lot, actually. And also, there are some things that you, as an author, might not feel comfortable with leaving up for interpretation. If that is the case, it has to be on the page. And so, as writers, if there is a certain theme in your story that you think is very, very important, you might want to avoid only using abstract language to describe it. Um, and that's not to say never use metaphor to describe the important themes of your story. That's not what this kind of, that's not it either. I'm just saying that be intentional about what you are putting on the page. And if you find that what you want the reader to get is not what they're getting, that is just a sign that you need to do some revision. Happens to me constantly. So this sort of thing matters because as writers, we can do a lot with language. And as we practice, we gain the ability to use these tools a lot more effectively. I don't think that it is good to privilege one form of language use over the other. Instead, I think it is important to know what comes most naturally to you as a writer and to examine why that might be the case. I know for me, and I say this on the slide, I have a tendency to write in a very abstract way. And in trying to avoid that, in recent fiction I've written, I overcompensated and I ended up writing like 1,000 words about walking up hills that I didn't need to have in the story. But if I hadn't been aware that I have a tendency to not be particularly grounded in reality and like space and time, I never would have done that overcompensation. But in my revision, I already kind of knew that, so I was able to revise a lot more efficiently. And the feedback I got from my peers was I was able to discuss it more openly because I had already done that kind of self reflection. So that's why it's important to think about how you use language and why. Not just because it, is the job of writing. That's what writing is. It just makes the job of writing easier. You just need to think about this kind of stuff. This sort of reflection will only make you a better writer. And so, to finish this off, go home and I want you to write anywhere between 300 and 500 words. Describe an event or a scene. Be as direct or concrete as possible. Doesn't matter if you think it sounds like the most boring thing you've ever read. This is an exercise. Then I want you to take the exact same scene and event and rewrite it using only abstract language. Do this exact same thing, but with abstract language. Use as much metaphor as you can. Make weird connections that you never would turn in because you think it makes you sound crazy. Like, have fun doing both of these things. And then once you're done, take a look at what they are. So that's part of why the word count on these are kind of short, because you're going to be writing it twice. If you feel so inclined, do it a third time and do it like a blend of abstract and concrete language. But either way, when you're writing these things, focus on what's coming naturally to you. Which one are you having a harder time with? And also, which one are you enjoying more? Because the one you're having a hard time with might also be the one you enjoy writing the most. Who knows? So that brings us to the end of the slides and the end of our lecture. I hope you enjoyed it.